Greetings, it is time for our monthly inflation scorecard update. And in this month's inflation scorecard update, we revisit my traditional matrix of 3%, 3%, 3%, and how all three of these measurements have to be above 3% for us to consider inflation to be structurally higher than optimal. Remember, 3% is optimal. Less than 3% is not the maximum amount of technological disruption for the least amount of pain for the poorest people, and too far below 3% is deflation, which is very bad, as you can study about in this video up in the right-hand corner's tag. So three measurements: the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the US CPI, the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index. This is the most important of the three because commodity inflation versus deflation is very directly tied to human prosperity versus human hardship. And that is much less true for service inflation, which is not included in the GSCI, because service inflation is simultaneous with wage increases. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the 10-year US Treasury yield, which is more an estimation of future inflation, but it has a tremendous amount to do with the U.S. fiscal situation and deficit spending, as well as the real estate market in the U.S. So I won't go into as much detail as I go through all three of these each month, because that's a lot of repetition for long-time viewers. For new viewers, you may want to see earlier month videos in this same series for greater explanations, but we'll run through these three pretty quickly. First, the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield. This is above 3%. It is 4.44% on this one-year chart. But if we take this 5-year chart, you can see how long it was below 3%. But at the moment, this is above 3%, but having a lot of trouble going higher. Every time it gets a little bit high, there is a weakening in the real estate market and the treasury market, and it falls back down. So this one is above 3%. Now we go to the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index. Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, the 10-year compound annual growth rate of this is minus 1.18%. Oil prices are falling because of increased production, and that is helping this go down. Also, gold is completely failing to rise above 2,000 for any sustained period of time. It's still on its very slow growth rate of 2% a year. This also includes natural gas, silver, copper, and all sorts of commodities. And this is the most important measurement of all because A, it is worldwide, and B, it comprises of freely traded commodities. A lot of people who like to imagine that inflation is higher than it is, they quickly claim that the CPI understates inflation, which is simply not true, because the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index is showing an even lower inflation rate. But even if they are not satisfied with the CPI, there is no argument against the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index because it is worldwide and it comprises of freely traded commodities, and therefore it is not manipulated and rigged as an entire index. Even if the price of oil is managed for a short while, that's just one commodity out of many. So this completely destroys the narrative of the high inflation people, and that is why this continues to be the most important measurement. And now we go to the US CPI. We'll go straight to the table rather than to the bls.gov website to make this video a little bit shorter. These are the readings of the CPI from the bls.gov website, which you can verify on your own. And the way to read this table is that the 1 month inflation rate annualized is this amount. So 1 month to the 12th power, 2 months to the 6th power, 3 months to the 4th power, 6 months square. That gives you this annualized number, because a lot of people think just the annualized number is important. Then the 1 year CPI growth rate is 3.2%, very close to what I would say is the optimal number, only slightly above the 3% measurement that I said. But of course, we look at this 10-year rate in terms of my matrix because that smooths out this noise. You can see how this is very volatile in short time periods. The 2-year inflation rate, square root, 3-year cube root, 5 years, fifth root, and of course, 10 years, 10th root. And this is how you see the annual inflation rate over all of these periods, so standardizing these different time windows. I even add another row for good measure, how since January 1st, 2001, what is the annual inflation rate? It is 2.5%, but for the purposes of our matrix, 2.8% is what we will see there, because that's the 10-year rate. When the 1-year rate was temporarily high, all kinds of people were saying, only the 1-year rate matters. Can't you see that inflation is 8% year over year? And I said, yeah, it's called data noise. There have been years that have been negative deflation as well. That's why you have to take a longer time window to do any sort of credible macroeconomic analysis of structural inflation. Now that the 1-year rate is down to 3.2%, these people are nowhere to be found, of course, because they are very, very deeply committed examples of people who don't want to know the truth. They just want to see evidence that what they already believe is the truth and ignore evidence that what they already believe is not the truth. So now we go back to our matrix. So we looked at all three of these measurements: US CPI 10-year compound annual growth rate, Goldman Sachs Commodity Index 10-year compound annual growth rate, and 10-year US Treasury yield on today, November 17th, 2023. And the answer was 2.8% for the US CPI, as we saw, minus 1.18% deflation for the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, the most important measurement of the three. And only one of these three is above 3%. The 10-year US Treasury yield is at 4.44%. Remember, if all three of these are exactly 3%, that is optimal. Now, we can't thread the needle exactly, so that almost never happens for any significant length of time, if at all. But only when all three are above 3% will we entertain any notion that inflation is high to a problematic extent. And even then, only high by the amount of the increment. 3.1 is very little above 3%. 3.2 is a little bit more above 3%. That way. But as long as commodities are in deflation, you are not going to have a situation of major structural inflation, and that is why so much money printing has not caused aberrantly high inflation. And this is contrary to a mainstream narrative, because people are always trained to worry about inflation, as per Kartik's law of inflation, which you can see in this tag in the upper right hand corner, debating via anecdote, claiming indices are rigged, claiming deflation is good, all of the above. All these ignorant psychological maladies comprise the common tactics that inflation fearmongers tend to use. But no, inflation is not high. I don't care what anyone says, because nobody really has a data-driven argument to refute that. Now, if you like this type of content and you found this informative, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much for watching. Technological singularity. Elon Musk, Tesla, inflation, Ray Kurzweil, Federal Reserve, inflation, hyperinflation, artificial intelligence, AI, Elon Musk, Tesla, Ray Kurzweil, technological singularity, universal basic income, technological disruption.